everyone, and thank you for being here. Thanks for coming along to what is session 2 in Dance For's 4-day symposium entitled Place to Dance. And over these 4 days we are asking that question, where is a place to dance? Or with tomorrow's event, who dances in those places? So looking around community. Last night we had a provocation led by choreographer Moran, which was at Nottingham Contemporary, that looked at dance in a visual arts and gallery context. So today's session really is looking at architecture and the body and the environment. So I'll hand you over to Jonathan shortly, but some of those themes around the artists we know who are very much creating works in using the influences of architecture or works within landscape and an urban environment. And so we have some panellists here, and Gabby will be joining us on Skype, and also then Susanna, who will later introduce herself, who's the creative director in your trousseau, to open up the discussion a little bit about what that means to communities to place work in that context and some of the challenges and questions around that. So just briefly, before I hand over to Jonathan, the format will be, we'll have a series of, we'll have the presentation from Jonathan, and there'll be a chance for other artists to introduce themselves and their practice, and then we'll just take a short break and lead into a more open discussion around the table where artists will be able to ask questions to each other, and then you as people to ask questions. A bit of housekeeping. If anyone needs the toilet, it's that way and right. Do feel free to come and go if you do need to. But so then to really introduce Jonathan, just to talk a little bit about himself and to offer his provocation.
You want me to start provoking?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'll need to go to slides if that's, if that's okay. So just switching them on. Maybe I don't know how well in terms of the camera. I need to be standing in the right place.
That's fine.
Should we try this? I'm happy to flip them on once I can. So I'm going to be. Great. I'll just okay. Is that okay? Great. Well, I did make some notes. Okay. What Stuart asked me to do was to, of course, try and be provocative about the title, or at least I started with the title, Place to Dance. And as an architect, I said this in the blurb that's on the flyer. Seeing the words dance and place in the same sentence is already a kind of provocation. It's suggesting something really interesting about the way in which movement, architecture, the body, the way they're, in a sense, kind of already co-implicated in the production of places. So I start off from this as a kind of launch pad, I suppose, into turning that title around and just, as it says here, just thinking about what it means to dance a place. That was my starting point. So I'm being initially provocative in saying maybe the title is wrong. Let's start by thinking about this in a slightly different way. The other aspect of this is what's suggested in the kind of subtitle there, if you can read it, what I've called the transformative effects of transgressive play. So that, in a way, a sort of wordy way of trying to just sum up what I'm hoping is the kind of basis of the provocation, I suppose. It's as much a provocation to architects as it is to anyone involved in dance, performance, visual arts, live arts, and so on. So in a way, I'm trying to provoke myself into thinking, perhaps a new way of thinking. Okay, this is a good start. That used to work.
It did.
We always say it works so well. How did you do that?
Down, not across.
Okay, this is probably familiar work. If any of you have delved into this kind of area, this notion about a kind of performative idea of placemaking. And it draws on, there are lots of references for this. 2 areas, particularly in geography, cultural geography and anthropology, particularly which both been influential in architecture. Tim Ingold is one of my favourite references in this area, but I put these in just to kind of flag up the kind of territory, or begin to suggest a territory that I'm trying to occupy, I suppose, with this notion of relationship between. Oh, so I've done it again. Oh no, it did work. Okay, but behind all that is an interest of mine, which is a current project. So this is why it's kind of in the forefront in the presentation. I've been working on a book about, a little kind of introductory book really, about Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And phenomenology is probably my kind of framework, I suppose, what I, if I had to name one area where a lot of my ideas come from, this would be it. But particularly from Merleau-Ponty, who tends to be, even in architecture, somebody not particularly engaged, or has not been engaged with in anything like the extent that philosophers like Martin Heidegger, for example, have been. And I think because of that history in recent architecture theory, Heidegger's work has come to dominate. So when you say phenomenology, people immediately think, oh, that's just Heidegger. Think that it's immediately about a kind of very traditional, very nostalgic idea of place. It's a very static thing, very much based on a kind of traditional humanist or human-centered, subject-centered idea of architecture and placement. But what it does in architecture is suggest that or at least it's part of the background to the idea of these so-called genius loci, the spirit of place, as being something which has kind of timeless, essential quality, and it's up to architects to identify, or to anyone designing in it, say in a place, to identify this and then simply just try and repeat it somehow, preserve it, capture it, reinforce it, project it into the future. But it's dominated by this kind of static idea. By contrast, I think one can approach Merleau-Ponty's work in a very different way, not in that kind of humanist, subject-centered way. And to see Merleau-Ponty as a kind of, in a way, almost a kind of post-human philosopher. At least this is the way that I read him. I'm trying, in small ways, to try and resituate his work for architects in order to do that. And by that I mean, what he tends to talk about subjectivity is something which emerges. It's not something given. It's not something we begin with and then have to try and reach out beyond the individual subject to engage with the world. He talks about a subject which emerges out of engagement, or out of just everyday life, out of experience. So subjectivity is something which is achieved. It's not given at the beginning. And performance, I would say, I think offers some interesting frameworks to think about that aspect of experience as something which has this kind of unfolding quality to it, through which we kind of discover ourselves, I suppose. We kind of construct ourselves as subjects through various ongoing processes of interaction with others, with objects, with the world in the broadest sense. Now, the other aspect of emergence, which I think is interesting, and Merleau-Ponty, when he's talking about language, I think is particularly useful in this issue. And it's work which is not always a particular essay on phenomenology of language, which is particularly, I think, useful. But I've taken a quote here from Phenomenology of Perception, which is Merleau-Ponty's major work. But he's suggesting here the way in which language operates, again in a sort of performative sense, so that language doesn't just represent pre-existing thoughts. It's not that we have thoughts kind of fully formed in the mind and then we simply choose a set of linguistic tokens in order to represent them. So language is not representing thought, it's actually realizing thought. So language in a way helps us to sort of produce thoughts, produce ideas. And he's suggesting here that when we speak as individuals, we kind of think we're in control of, we know what we want to say before we open our mouths. And of course, even anecdotally, we know this is not always the case. We are often literally surprised by what comes out of our mouth. And he's suggesting this is something quite profound. He's telling us there's something quite profound going on there, in the sense that language surprises us as speakers as much as it does our listeners. So language has, I would say again, a kind of performative quality in the sense of helping us to realize ideas. Now, the interesting thing, this is the essay on language, which I always recommend, of course, partly because it's short and readable, I would say. It's in a book called Signs, so it's one of his later essays on the phenomenology of language. What I think is interesting in this essay that he tries to do is begin to suggest how language evolves, how language changes, or basically how new language is created. And he suggests here, I think, a really interesting, kind of compelling phrase, this idea of a process of coherent deformation. This notion that, of course, we're limited in the sense that we have to work with language as it exists before us, language invented by others. We can't begin to start from scratch inventing our own language. Nobody would understand what we were saying. So we have that as a limitation. We have to begin with at least the kind of tools that existing language offers, but we're always pushing against those limits, even in just an everyday sense. Each time we open our mouths and speak, we're changing language slightly. And he's trying to describe what this process involves. And it can be sometimes conscious, very consciously, the kind of language that poets use very often has a certain level of strangeness about it, which is often what makes it difficult, sometimes challenging to read, to kind of extract something from. But what he's suggesting is kind of that deliberate playing with forms of language, those ready-made linguistic components, if you like, by coherently deforming them, twisting them somehow, arranging them in a new sense. Of course, again, is a component of that idea of that process of surprise, that idea that even us as speaking subjects are surprised by what we say. Okay, I'm going to make a jump forward. So that's a bit of historic, in a sense, recent history in terms of theory. I just wanted to flag up that one of the reasons why I think why Merleau-Ponty is so interesting right now is that he is being, in a sense, rediscovered. His work is having a whole new wave of influence, particularly in the area of cognitive science, or what's known as embodied cognitive science. And it's to do with realizing again, or trying to kind of rediscover, I suppose, the importance of embodiment in cognition, just in the process by which meaning is constructed and so on. And this discourse also is influenced by recent findings in neuroscience. And this is one I think is particularly interesting, which is now, it's been around since the late 1990s, this idea, so-called mirror neurons system in the brain, which is activated by both ourselves. It's a system that operates when we're performing an action ourselves, partly also controlling our own movements, but the same system is activated when we're simply observing somebody else performing the same actions. So it highlights this very close link between action and perception, which is one of the key elements of Merleau-Ponty's understanding of perception. So back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, Merleau-Ponty was already, if you like, anticipating developments like this. So I think this is an interesting. Why I think this is important from in relation to performance will hopefully become clear in a minute. But it is something to do with this idea of performance from the spectator's point of view in relation to the performer. So there's the sense that performance encourages us to perform, perhaps, or inspires new kinds of performances in ourselves. But even just perceiving another, an act of performance, I think, even though we're not doing it, in a sense we are, according to this idea. The mirror neuron system suggests that even passive spectating is active in some sense. We're going through a process, you might call it a kind of empathic process, somehow projecting ourselves into the action that's being performed. But it again, I think, highlights the closeness of the link between performing and spectating, which I think is really interesting. Okay, sorry for this one thought. Just a high start change here. There is something here, this is a link back in a way, a continuation of that discussion about mirror neurons. Just in terms of the way we read the environment, the American psychologist James J. Gibson coined the term affordances, suggesting that what we perceive in an environment, or what we first perceive, whilst our kind of initial grasp of a space was only kind of introduced into a room, maybe blindfolded, we open our eyes, and we begin to make sense of the space we find ourselves in. He suggests that the first thing we do is that we make sense of the possibilities it offers us to do things. So that's where our sense of, if you like, our sense of self begins to emerge from a recognition of what we're able to do. And Merleau-Ponty uses the term I can rather than an I am. And he's taking issue, of course, with Descartes' famous idea of I think, therefore I am. He suggests that our first sense of who we are as subjects is based on this idea of what we can do, rather than who we are. So that's a more abstract, and in a way, a level that comes much later, kind of intellectual construction of ourselves as subjects, where we say, yes, I am something. Prior to that is the more phenomenological idea that we engage with space, of course, through the body. That's the key thing, is what we can do is as much to do with our physical embodiment as it is to do with anything intellectual. So Gibson's idea here, if you look, obviously we see a handrail, or most of us at least that are not skateboarders. I used to be a long time. I never did anything quite like this, but I would still see that as a handrail. Even if I was still skateboarding, I would probably say, no, that's a handrail. That's not a skateboarding implement, it's not a skate park. Of course, if you can do this, you don't see a handrail, you see an opportunity, an affordance here. You're offered to again, realise yourself as a skateboarder in an urban context. This one you might recognise, this is Lucinda Grange, so-called extreme photographer. What I think is interesting about this one is that this is a place that nobody goes. And I'm going to try and finish off with an idea just about kind of traces, or the notion between temporary transience and permanence. The kind of notion of the event and the ephemerality of an event, like the skateboarder. Comparing that with the relative permanence of, or potential permanence of traces that are left behind. How some of these practices kind of write themselves into the plane or the history of the place. And of course this one doesn't, in the sense that we would never go there, most people would never see this site. But the way the photograph captures an event, I think, and gives it a kind of permanence is interesting. So having seen this, there is some sense of a kind of permanent change in our perception. So we might look up and see this eagle's head from the ground, the Chrysler building in New York, of course. And having seen the photograph, our perception, I think, is somewhat altered by the fact that we know somebody has been there, and there is some evidence to prove that. Okay, the second, the middle bit. This is getting, yeah. There's 3 bits to this provocation. Okay, the middle bit is trying to get us back into something a bit more architectural. I just wanted to highlight, and I'll go through these quite quickly. It's just a series of quick images. Something about the history of, well, in a way, it's something about the history of performance, but it's also about the history of public space in the city. This is an idea, of course, that goes back to, we tend to think to the medieval times, the kind of medieval origins of the theatre as we know it today, as something that happened in public space. And with mobile structures, with almost kind of installation pieces brought in such that public spaces could be transformed. That's one for Renaissance engraving, 1493, a series of stages. Of course, Passion plays are an interesting, in a way, a relic of this, or at least a continuing example of this. I mean, these do still happen in various places around the world in different forms. But it highlights the idea that the theatre is a kind of formal space. The notion of a stage separate from the auditorium, a proscenium arch, and the kind of formality of that separation of audience and performance is not is a fairly recent invention. It's kind of Victorian, more or less 19th century invention, a kind of formalization. I know we can say the Greek Roman theatre has elements of that already, but in terms of the theatre model that dominates today, it's a relatively recent invention. And theatre, and you could say the kind of roots of theatre begin much more closely embedded with everyday life. That's really the point that I wanted to suggest. And paintings like the Bruegel piece, Battle of Carnival and Lent, just kind of, I think, usefully remind us of that. There's nothing very formal here about a kind of formal performance and an audience. If you try to draw a line, where's the division between the audience and the performance? It's quite hard to do that. You could do it perhaps on a micro scale. I mean, there's a sense that there's a little mini performance going on here, and there's a bunch of people here that, well, maybe they're involved in it, but maybe they're watching it. But that doesn't matter, and there's a certain interchange. I mean, you can see that's the kind of key that gets part of the battle. And of course, Nottingham has this. There's an element of this, even in the history of Nottingham, in the relocation of the Goose Fair, which of course used to happen right in the centre of the city. Apparently until it got just a bit too successful, just a little bit out of control. And then before somebody decided, I'm not sure we can have this going on now in front of our new, what will be, of course, our spanking new council house. We can't have all this rough, behaviour, out of control behaviour going on. So of course now it's just up the road here. So it's kind of on the edge. We kind of need it. It has to be there, but it's a kind of, in a way, become a kind of alter ego for the city, a kind of alternative. Foucault, I guess, would call it kind of heterotopia, kind of other, almost like an other city. Okay, so in a way, this hopefully kind of summarizes what I think is still really important about that idea of those kind of events, I suppose, what it is, a deeper kind of transformational effect of those kinds of public performance events. And this is, I think, a really key term, liminality. This definition, I think, is almost a bit of a Wikipedia kind of definition. I was trying to find it in Victor Turner, who I think is one of the key theorists of this idea from the it was an anthropologist, late 60s, early 70s. But it touches on some really nice points, I think, which is what those slides were trying to kind of capture. Something about this idea, fluid, malleable situation that enables new institutions. And I think some of those, what Merleau-Ponty was calling coherent deformations, are sort of allowed to happen. There's a certain kind of loosening of the bonds, if you like, of kind of normality, normal life, a certain relaxation of the rules, often quite literally kind of swapping of roles in these kind of festival events, whether they happen in villages, whether they're agricultural festivals, or urban ones, often very similar patterns that get repeated. Okay, so that's that one. Yeah, so this was just a reminder about that, and we touched on this a little bit, talking with people at last night's event, about interesting time when theatre in the late 60s, early 70s, this is Richard Scheckner, the New York theatre director, who I put him up partly because he's somebody I think really interesting, has reached out, has engaged with architects and architecture students over a number of years. I was lucky enough to see a lecture by Scheckner in Canada in about 1994, which was a day, well, a couple of days of like a 3-hour lecture, his whole history of his life in theatre, fantastic, and then a day-long workshop where he got a group of architecture students basically to take over the building, take over the School of Architecture building, and through the day develop a series of ideas for small-scale performances really that would happen in different parts of the building, and then in the evening open it up to the whole school to then to come and take part in. And for me, as a young, basically a young lecturer, it was a real kind of eye-opening experience. But what I think is interesting about this period, going back to this late 60s, early 70s, is just the notion of a kind of, again, to do with breaking of boundaries, a kind of liminal stage in the history of visual arts and performance, in the sense where there's a sort of merging of forms and crossing of boundaries, but particularly with theatre, a sense of trying to rediscover some of that medieval history, in a way, or some of those qualities of theatre which turns itself inside out. And famously, this is the Performing Garage in Soho in New York, with a big roller shutter, which was just an industrial shed, literally, big roller shutter here, which some performances would open up, and the performance would spill out onto the street. And the performances, again, would often be more durational. They might last all day, or the rehearsals might be opened up on the last day. Audience would come along and have lunch or whatever, eat and drink with the performers, and then gradually something slightly more formal would kind of happen at some point in the evening. But that linked back to those much looser kind of medieval examples I showed before. I think this is a good example of that. This, I think, might even be the last. Is this the last slide? Oh, there's one. Okay, nearly the last slide. Maybe this is part of the provocation, and this is one of the things I wanted to kind of finish on. It's just this idea about performance. In a way, there's just kind of everyday notions about performance, about something happening in a space, which is fantastic. If you happen to be there, if you happen to be involved in it, or to witness it, it's great. But what happens after? A lot of the really interesting performances, and I think we're getting better at doing this, but a lot of them just kind of disappear, and they're not visible in a way that I think they could be. We're getting better, I think, at recording them and finding ways of capturing some aspect of them, perhaps in a virtual sense, like we're doing with today's event, filming it and archiving it, putting it out online, all those things. What I like about this idea is that there's several things going on. There's a certain scale of permanence in that the line, of course, is there, or will be there for a few weeks after he's walked it. But of course the photograph, again, like the Lucinda Grange one, becomes an important has a kind of permanence in capturing that, the fact that this thing happened. And I've always been curious about this as an artwork, as to where the artwork is, or what it is. Is it the line in the grass? Not really. You'd think, well, it's the photograph. But of course, since then, this is one of Long's pieces. I think he did this when he was still a student. The later work has kind of diverged, and he's worked in a way across all those definitions. And in some cases, yeah, the event is, or his performance for him as an audience of one, is kind of, well, that is the work in a sense. But he often, of course, makes things, arranges material in the space, and captures that in some sense. And in other ways, records the event, or records a route he might have walked. And that has a kind of permanence and gets perhaps exhibited in a gallery as a map with a route drawn on it and so on. Okay, well, that thing about the recording and the kind of writing of the event into the history of the place, I think for me as an architect is important, because obviously I'm used to dealing with more permanent lumps of stuff, physical stuff, and dealing with the more transient aspects of the performance, even on an everyday level. For most architects, it's quite difficult, it's quite problematic. And most architects tend to shut that off and think about their building as it's finished and it's perfect on day one. Well, it's the best it's going to be when it's handed over, day one. And as soon as you open the doors and let people in, then it's all downhill. So you get it photographed, maybe the day before you let people in. James Sterling, famously, when he designed the Claw Gallery, the extension of Tate Britain, wanted to have an opening of the building first without any paintings in it. I don't think the Tate let him do this, but I think he did do it at this Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart in Germany. Had an opening of the building empty, just so that you could, of course, enjoy the architecture properly. But anyway, Merleau-Ponty, the quote from Merleau-Ponty is just, I suppose, just to sum up, of course, it's self-explanatory, but it's just that idea about how important that sense of us to sort of finding ourselves in the things around us, objects, buildings, places, people, and so on, and how they reflect back to us something about ourselves. Yeah. Okay. Is that okay? I'll stop there. Yeah?
Thank you.
Take a breath. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. What I think would be helpful, as I said earlier, is now to really introduce the panel and give them some time just to talk about themselves or some of their practices, and then after the break we can take some of Jonathan's thinking and some of the kind of thoughts of the panel and the experiences that they've had into a discussion. So I'm going to start with you. So, you knew I was going to. So this is Simone Kenyon, who is an artist who's had a relationship with dance for a number of years, but you can talk a bit more about your practice.
I'll just spend a few minutes. Okay, where to begin? I've been working as a dancer, a choreographer, a live artist, a producer, and all kinds of things. I make work for studios, outside, in mountains, in streets. I guess I'm trying to not define myself as a particular artist that works with certain confines, but I think there's a kind of thread that goes through the practice which is of interest in how walking can be used as a choreographic practice, or to talk about working rurally or in urban landscapes and using environments as certain scores. I suppose the first works that Dance for supported like 10 years ago, or some of the long distance walking projects I did, were to do with this kind of sense of our experiences as the performers. But as my practice has continued, I think I'm becoming much more concerned or interested in how as artists we can facilitate other people's physical understandings of environments and spaces. So less about my experience as the artist performing in a space, but more about how do we construct structures or systems for other people to also embody that thinking or framework in their own city or place. At the moment, I'm currently working on a project in the Culhane Mountains in Scotland, which is to do with really looking at how women experience this particular landscape, based on a book by Nan Shepherd that was written in the 40s called The Living Mountain, and just thinking about the plethora of writing by men kind of mountaineering circuits. There's not actually very many female writers that aren't just talking about women's roles in how mountaineering developed. So it's sort of moving away to architecture, but essentially I'm interested in how women talk about their experiences and how they can bring about an understanding of their own sort of tacit knowledge and embodied knowledge into when they're walking in the mountains, and that somehow will then inform how I make the next dance performance, which will happen outside, and it will be a performance, but also through leg walks and workshops. So that's where I'm currently at the moment. There's a few of these things that I made for a dance floor a few years ago, which we could pass around as well, called Step by Step, Small Sequences for a City. I made these with my other collaborator, Neil Culhane, and they're just small provocations about just bringing people's focus and perspective to framing moments and seeing the city in a way that's just very small. I'm not interested in creating the huge spectacular performances, but I'm interested in how people can just see where they live or how they experience where they live in these very small ways. So you can have a look at those as well later. I think I'll leave it there.
Simone. Gabby, as you're hovering in the background. So Gabby's joining us via Skype from her home. So Gabby, do you just want to introduce yourself a little bit more and some of your practices and works?
Yes, I can. Yes. Gabriele Reuter I'm in Berlin right now. And I work as a dancer, choreographer, and almost urbanist. Just this week, finalizing my MA in urban studies. And I work between Berlin and Nottingham, and I've had a long relationship with dance floor in several different ways. And one big body of my work is making works for the stage, I would say, traditionally for black box theatres. And the topic of those works, of the most recent works I've made, was around the notion of space. And I think very naively or basic on the notion of space as material, so very directly the space around me as using as material and understanding as material. That turned into a research more to do with connecting with place and with an interest in cities. I've made a series of city lectures that connected to the theories of Georges Perec, and I would say also that the situation is so an idea of putting different maps on top of each other and understanding making an inventory of different types of spaces in different cities, like Paris and Santiago de Chile and in Utrecht, such as that. And then the most recent work for the stage I've made was on the connection between sound and space. So this was very pragmatically from the concept of physics to look at the space around us, literal space around us being not being empty, and to understand, make it clearer what's in there. So that's one part of the work that also connects to really a practice as a dancer and a teaching practice, mediating dance practice. The other part of my artistic work, or where my interest is shifting towards, is into the territory of urban studies and historical urban studies, so urban history and city research. And that very much brought this topic of space on towards the idea of the social construction of space, much more wider concepts of space, the spatial turn, the idea of people producing space, very simply put. That is something that now feeds into my interest as an artist, and really questioning also how, in my practice as a dance artist, how can I get involved in that, in a productive, in a way, in an interesting way, that stage only. It's still an interesting medium for me, but that really leads on towards entering the urban space, the city, and also concepts around city planning, community participation, and to see like how can I, as a choreographer, as a dancer maybe, as a choreographer, get involved into that field productively, and how can I engage with architecture in a way that I thought what Jonathan was saying was like how I was finishing with this idea that normally dance kind of, or that's how I understood it, that dance begins when the architect, when the building is finished, then the dance can begin and relate to the building. That's something that I'm kind of less interested in. I'm more interested in this idea: is there a productive collaboration in the process of creating architecture? Where is the choreography inside the architectural process, and how can I bring myself into that? So this is an interest. And then some most recent kind of different format of work that I've been experimenting with in collaboration with Dance 4 was a sound installation, and this was a sound installation based on the recordings or interviews with the people of Snenten and St. Anne's, with their memory of social living, of work, of housing in Snenten and St. Anne's. And this was shown this was made for Backlight Gallery in Snenten last September. And that was, it was done in collaboration with the sound artists from Berlin here, and we edited together a whole range of interviews, and then looked at how to place these stories, different stories from different subjects, around the gallery space in Snenten, and kind of invite the audience on a journey of engaging with memory somehow. And somehow for me it was important to look at this really disconnected from dance, from making a dance work, and very much looking at the connection between memory, choreography, history, somehow placed, and how to arrange the memories of these people that we were engaging with in a building, and how to invite an audience into that experience, how to invite them to create their own choreography of that experience, physically by walking through it, but also by what's happening in the way that they're connecting with the material, somehow choreographically. So that's, at the moment, these are the fields that I'm working in, the practical dance work, the new installations, this new format with installations, and very pragmatically, the MA that I'm writing on is about Nottingham, and it's about community participation and urban planning processes. So that very much brings the very down-to-earth and pragmatic level of, for me, questioning how can artists be involved in these processes of community participation. What is the moment for them to be involved? What is not the moment for them to be involved? What are the power relationships there? And how do we have to be aware as artists when we get into this field of tension? So that's me.
Thank you, Gabby. Which leads nicely to Susanna Bedford, who is the creative director of the Renewal Trust in Nottingham. And Susanna is someone we've worked with on a number of projects, but also someone I regularly email and say, can we bring this piece of work to Snenten and St. Anne's? And we've had many conversations, and part of today, the discussion will focus on some of those audiences and what it means to place works in those contexts and really engage those audiences. So, do you want to just say a little bit about yourself and some of the kind of works we've done together, other projects you've been involved in those areas?
Definitely, thank you. So I'm effectively an arts producer, and I work as creative director within a regeneration charity that works across the two neighbourhoods that Gabby mentioned, Snenten and St. Anne's. And I studied literature. I discovered live art at Nottingham Trent. I then became a producer in theatre in London for a few years, and then I moved back here and became an arts fund within the dance department at the Arts Council. So I've sort of got quite a broad kind of art form background, but I think there's been one key thread of questioning for me throughout all of that, which is how do you get this to audiences who aren't arts literate. How do you engage people, but still keeping that quality and the integrity of the art? So I'm really fortunate to have this role. It sort of started out as a pilot, really, with a project strand that we call Nut Ballet, and it's kind of turning it on its head. So sort of working as a producer, but not from an arts organisation, from within the community. And we partnered with the Birmingham Royal Ballet and the Dance 4, and we developed this quite a large-scale participatory project. So it's working with 60 young people across the 2 neighbourhoods, and that was quite an eye-opener, really, because that was about bringing something very unexpected to an area. So people started, the notion of sort of taking ballet to areas of urban deprivation. It's been done before in Ballet, but for these areas, it just seemed very incongruous. And so I think that's what my work has been trying to achieve in many ways. Is, for instance, we did a Museums at Night project with Rankin, the fashion photographer, on the St Anne's allotments, and that was two very different elements coming together, or having the European Arts and Theatre Festival within a community centre. So it's, for me, it's about how do you transform a place and how people feel about that through art, through events happening there. And with Dance 4, we've done quite a few projects now, so they've kind of ranged quite a bit from thinking just about the outdoor performances. Some of them are site specific. So there was Spill, which was Street Dance Exchange, so that was on Windmill Park, that was on a playground, and that was kind of made purposely for that space, for families. And then we kind of think of something very different, like a street dance project with Lone Twin, which I was involved in, which was incredible. And then we did the Amory, so that came from Not That, so that took place in a couple of squares in Snelton. So they're very different projects, and it might be later about how people interact with those different ways.
And then Ruth and Anne-Marie, who have just come to a period, at the end of a period of research, and are about to embark on another period of research, working with agriculture and farm in Lincolnshire. So do you want to talk a little bit about that project yourselves? Would you like your slides?
Yeah. So I'm Anne-Marie, and my practice is around creating situations or scores or frameworks for bringing people together and more in connection to each other and land. So those sort of structures can take different forms, so they're not always performative. They could be around doing a practical task together, they could be around feasting or preparing and cooking a meal together. They can take lots of different formats, but I guess what's important is the design and the framework quite often relates to landscape, active relationship to landscape. So I kind of started off my arts practice of being more, I did a residency on Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh, which was more looking at how people relate to a kind of iconic monument in one sense, and also a park, place to walk your dogs. Looking at all the different ways that those people's stories in relationship to that landscape interacted on a more kind of recreational or contemplative sense of what landscape means to us. And then since then I've gotten much more interested, and maybe through I've done quite a lot of activism, performance activism, and I'm sort of passionate sort of environmental campaigner in it as well. My background's in geography, and I think I've got really interested in what an active relationship to the land means through farming, through growing food, through managing landscapes, and then I guess how that more active relationship, interrelationship, and more detailed sense of knowing what an environment brings into, or not an environment, what a place offers to to us then can translate into something that's a more deep, kind of profound connection. So that's why I find agriculture and horticulture really interesting, because I think a lot of our culture came from our connection to the land through agriculture, kind of in the name there. And a lot of our songs and our dances came from that experience of working the land. And now we don't really work the land. But we may have to work the land again. So what is our relationship to the land in that active way now? And what are those, do we have any rituals or ways to connect to seasonality? To the fact that this cycle, which we're quite disconnected from, which provides everything we need to survive and live, and the fact that, what's our relationship to bees? Without bees, we're not here. So I'm kind of interested in all of those stories around connection to landscape as an actual force for living. So this slide is from a piece that I've just reignited in the last 2 years, and that started in 2004, which was a protest piece at the House of Commons with 4 masked figures. I'm not going to talk too much about that now, but I've gone back into that work because I think it's still really potent, and I'm really interested in our project together, which is a field of wheat or flatlands. We're looking at large-scale food growing in Lincolnshire. So we're trying to bring ourselves back into that landscape and experience it through our presence there, through being in those environments where people just generally aren't at all. And most of the time, for example, when I'm on a train going up and down the country, if I see someone in a field, I get really interested in what they're doing, because it's something you just don't see. We don't see people out in the rural landscape. So what's our relationship to those landscapes now? And particularly in Lincolnshire, it's like the heartland of our agricultural system. It's the breadbasket of the UK, and has been for several hundred years. So, and most of the farms there are just massive. And our whole journey into flatlands, which we've been researching for about 2 years now, started with just that feeling of we want to get into those landscapes. There's huge grain stores. Like, what's it feel like to be standing next to them? I think there's a slide of me. Can you skip through? You got one of the grain store?
Yeah. This one coming in.
Oh, right, I didn't know. There. So sort of looking at the human being in these the landscapes that are designed not for people to be, it feels quite precarious even being in that space as a human being, because you will be in a bit in that space. So that's where we're at the moment in terms of that project Flatlands. And then I think if you go back a few slides, keep going back there. Back one more. So this is just an example of a piece called Abundance, or Abundance, from a project which was called Abundance, which was an urban harvesting fruit tree urban harvesting project that I created with Stephen Watts. And this is quite a spontaneous dance, which was choreographed in about 20 minutes on an allotment, specifically for that space, with a piece of music that was gifted to the project by a musician. And I guess it just shows it's about, I'm really interested in creating new forms or new rituals around that relationship to food, place and seasonality.
Can we skip to the one person jumping up and down? Yeah, there's one on the left. So I'm Ruth, I'm based in Sheffield, and I guess for quite some time I came from a fine art background, and I make work with a number of different mediums, but I kind of found a spiritual home, if you like, as a sort of sculptor filmmaker, but I never made sculptures or very rarely make films. But somehow I felt at home there. And then, yeah, a lot of my work for about 10 years was very much rooted into an investigation, a genuine interest into how things are and how they work, and that is the driver for me. I want to find something out, and then that really kind of excites me. And then normally what I do is I go through this crash course of learning something quite crudely, and I sort of somehow experiment with that understanding of learning, and then I present that as the work. So the process is sort of revealing of all of these contradictions and idiosyncrasies that come out of trying to understand the systems by which we organise ourselves. So I've done a lot of things with mapping and stuff that really explores perception of time, distance, speed and scale, and how technology has completely shifted those. So I'm often interested in transportation, moving through the landscape, and how transportation kind of shifts our perception of moving through the landscape. And measurement becomes a really important part of that. So the human body comes in as a kind of resistance, reluctance for me. I always end up kind of doing these performances, or this, I realise these conceptual ideas, and then I have this moment of realisation where it's like, oh shit, I'm going to have to be in the performance, aren't I? Rather than wanting to use the body as any tool of expression. It's like, oh no. Here we go again. This one is a piece called Past Signal, which kind of explored the basic physics of the speed of light and speed of sound. Stuff, you know, a lot of the stuff that I learn is kind of, you know, really sort of primary school or secondary school stuff, but there's a kind of imagination in it. There's something that it's a given, so much of a given that it becomes invisible again. So this is a performance that I've done in a number of different places where I build special shoes. They're basically metal plates on the bottom, stuck on the bottom of trainers, and I jump up and down in a far landscape, and the audience, whether it's sometimes live, sometimes film, are at least normally 200 metres, 250 metres away, so it's like 324 metres for sound to travel in a second, give or take wind and propagation and stuff. So you kind of just get the delay of light and sound, but the way I frame it becomes kind of really important. So I was really interested in ideas around signal to noise ratio and clarity, so how we understand how far something is and how you can present a performance to kind of really emphasise or play with that. So I did that for a number of things around that, around sort of, I guess, invisibility, really, and measurement, and human scale, or whatever that idea of human scale is. But more recently, I mean, I guess that placed me very much in the land, but rather than kind of, the focus used to be, I guess, on about the phenomenon and the perception and the materiality or the science itself. That placed me in the land, and then that kind of started to open up the world of what we're doing to this land, how we kind of build our infrastructure and navigate through it, but also what's the impact of that on the land. So that kind of opened up into this world of, I guess, you know, the environment and the ecology and all of the things that are kind of so kind of potent today. And then, so I struggled for a while, but it's now put me in a place that has exploring those things again, but with a much more kind of consciousness of the decisions that we make. So for the last year and a half, I've been artist in residence in the Faculty of Engineering, and I'm exploring ideas around infrastructure, most recently urban water management and things like that. So stuff that kind of still deals with you know, our relationship to the environment and the systems and infrastructure we navigate through in order to understand and move around that environment, but much more kind of around kind of like questioning the impact of those. And then I do a lot of walking as well, and that would kind of maybe explore our administrative and bureaucratic systems. So I did a piece in collaboration with an artist called Ian Nesbitt, where I walked the bureaucratic Sheffield, the boundary line of the metropolitan city of Sheffield. So the line itself is a kind of bureaucratic administrative line, but when you walk it, you start to kind of reveal some interesting conversations and very difficult walking around private land, down streams and scrambling. And of course the collaboration with Anne-Marie, which is kind of where we came together on the idea of sort of, my drive initially wasn't so much around food production, but kind of more land management. But over the last year, that's kind of, you know, melded into a messy pot of lots of different ways of understanding industrial mechanisation of processing the land, whether it be food or roads and infrastructure.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. We're just going to take a 5-minute break now for people to get teas and coffees, and then we will open a discussion about Jonathan's provocation and some of the things that the panel has talked about. So thank you. So we've kind of heard from everyone as the panel, and what Jonathan and I just discussed now. Jonathan's got a question that's kind of been a bit of a thread through what everyone's presented, so Jonathan will offer that and then a chance for the panel to respond, and then we'll open up to you to kind of share your thoughts and ask some more questions. So Jonathan.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a theme that I just started to put out at the end of, towards the end of the series that I was going through, and I thought maybe it's the one about legacy and the idea about the sort of life after the performance. Because I think from hearing what you all had to say, it was really interesting. I feel sort of already start to imagine what your response to that question might be, because you all were kind of suggesting that there are implications, if you like. The work has some implications. It's not just there and it's gone. You do it for a reason, and part of that is that it has a life beyond the moment of the performance. But I'm guessing in perhaps quite different ways for all of you. So I thought maybe if you started at that end with Ruth and Anne-Marie, you might finish nicely with Suzanne, because I'm imagining that for you legacy in some ways might be where you begin, where you want to start from that point, and that's really what you want to create, and then you think about, okay, how do we achieve that? And I'm guessing that as artists, you maybe don't do that necessarily, but you might begin with the work, and the legacy kind of, if there happens to be one, that's fine, but there's a kind of additional, but anyway, I'm starting to answer the question, so stop the very bad habit. Yeah.
Well, we can talk over each other like we normally do.
Well, there's two really different responses that I've got. One maybe is about our collaborative project around the Lincolnshire farmers, and the other one I just wanted to pick up on, and then I want to bury it. Just need to get it out there. Is when you reference the Richard Long piece and then the photograph and where the photograph lies, something that I kind of find a bit frustrating and maybe, or interesting, but kind of like talked to death about in one sense, and also that so there's the kind of whole world of commodification, sort of performance artists kind of actually using kind of using the body in visual art in the first place as a performance to kind of non-commodify, to stop making objects to become part of the market, which was really important. And then you kind of had this cycle of ending up documenting the performances or the aftermath of the performances, then the photographs become all part of the commodity kind of thing. So there's kind of that legacy that
The whole of Abramovich.
Yeah, exactly. Which has been talked about a lot, and I just wanted to flag it up and put it there. Then another sense of legacy, and I have a real problem with the word legacy, and I just don't want to use it, quite frankly. But putting that one to a side, I think I'd quite like to explain briefly about one aspect, or the central aspect of our project, which probably does go into a form of legacy, but maybe we wouldn't use those terms, where one of the focuses of the project is that, we're trying to get to now, after quite a long period of research, working with 3 different farmers across Lincolnshire, all focusing on wheat growing, is that we're getting a collective of people together, possibly around 50 people,
who we're going to buy shares together collectively to grow a field of wheat that's not being sown yet. And that will be the central core of the project, of which around that a number of performances and invitations to the land and actions to become part of that process of the growing and celebrating and decision making on how that wheat's grown. So I think in terms of kind of
trying to use a different word. This is what I'm to find out.
Yeah.
Same words mean very different things.
Yeah. So I guess it's about a kind of sense of genuine engagement, so that when you come into a place or a community even, that one of the reasons it's taken us so long, probably 2 years all in all, to kind of get to this stage of our project, is because for Anne-Marie it was less new, me it was kind of very new, but for both of us, kind of large-scale agriculture was fairly new. And I felt that, you need to really, you can't kind of go in and then come out. And actually, the cycle of wheat growing takes, a long time. So we've only seen 2 cycles, and we're only now going to start again on a new cycle. So I think, and also when you get the opportunity to bring very diverse people together, which is what we're hoping to do, people with different shares and stakes, so people in the agricultural business, the farmers themselves, the local communities, the general public who consume, then if you're talking about creating a framework to get them to understand the process from a maybe new perspective, and also to start having a dialogue amongst each other, then that takes time and a serious amount of investment in lots of different ways. So for me, legacy comes from a sort of partly about sort of opening up a channel or a way or a space or a period of time where people can discover for themselves within a certain framework, so that the meaning becomes, they have time to understand and they're not told what the meaning is, or they're not told what to think, because then the resonance doesn't spread very far.
Can I just add to that around cyclical, seasonal things? That's a really helpful way to sort of keep coming back to something, but in a new way. So I'm working on a project with Loughborough University, and this thing about time, it's potentially a 50-year project, whether I'm still there at the end.
Funding over 3 years.
and I'm funded for potentially 10 years to do that on a not on a huge level, but there's something about that investment framework which doesn't normally operate within the arts, where somebody said to me, this project needs 10 years to become established, and that's only 10 cycles of seasons, that's only 10 harvests, and by that time, at that moment, then the community is more involved and my position is more withdrawn. So I go from being a catalyst to someone who's just part of a collective of people that are just doing something. So yeah, that's maybe one.
And I think that idea of time, which is kind of where we started to initially work together, that's what brought us together in one sense, becomes really fascinating, because now we're in a really interesting place where we have to be able to try to imagine quite some years into the future to understand how we make the decisions and what decisions we're making now. And I think that's one of the really interesting challenges that we've got, because we can't tend to see past our generation of our own children or their grandchildren. And I just recently watched a film about the Into Eternity, it was called, which was to do with the Finnish kind of infrastructure system of burying nuclear waste, and it needs to have something ridiculous like 100,000 years or 10,000 years to become safe. And how do you create markers or a narrative to tell future generations? So just the idea of we have to think so far into the future is so foreign to us. So I think that idea of legacy and time is a really interesting one for us to manage now, when we generally think of the immediate, but that immediate, you know, the immediate future and the medium future is now fragile. So we, in order to get our heads around that, we would need to get our heads around how to understand into the future much further than we can.
Right. Okay, that's great. Yeah. Simone, do you want to?
Well, I would probably agree with a lot of what you were saying, and yeah, the term legacy, I'm also not quite sure about that word either. I just had to look up the definition for myself. So there was quite a few different ones. So I might say a gift or an invitation is probably more closer to what I'm interested in talking about in terms of a legacy. But yeah, I think sometimes, I'm interested in giving people a gift that somehow roots the work back to them, and how the artist actually again becomes invisible and leaves the process. I mean, that's not always possible when you're making performance work, but actually, like for instance, a 3-month residency, which is a kind of general, kind of, you know, commissioned piece of, you know, in terms of a monetary aspect. I agreed to split that over an 18-month period and go back to the same place in Scotland, do a long-distance walk that went through very remote communities, and to try and be a kind of moving conduit that connects these very small villages together, and somehow to create a dialogue through eating together, through walking together, through these invitations or gifts that then eventually those people that I build relationships through this act of walking and creating this choreographic score, if you like. They become the people who put walkers up in their houses. So it's actually, the work became more about how do you link these communities to people who might visit North East Scotland who would never walk there before because of various land ownership situations in that area as well. So, you know, the world takes over the work sometimes, and regardless of what you think you might end up doing. So, in terms of a legacy, sometimes, you know, the legacy could be that I don't own it anymore, and I'm quite happy with that. I think something like, for instance, a piece of work at the moment which we made, myself and Culhane, which is a very simple duet that we showed in the festival here in Nottingham. We've now been commissioned to do something for Fierce Festival, to work with local dancers and performers, but to look at how you use that very simple piece. And we'll be working with a young architect from the AA as well, who will be in conversation with us about how do we look at space in Birmingham, how do we reconfigure or mirror back to people who live there, potentially through these very simple and quiet and slow acts. Can dance offer a reflection to people of their own city, just through us exploring very small aspects of the architecture and working with local dancers to kind of expand actually upon the choreographic processes that we've been through. So again, it's kind of this thing of taking the material and sharing it and spreading it out into different communities or different interests, because otherwise as a dancer or a choreographer, what am I making? Just something like, how does it keep living? How do we keep exploring the material? But I would, you know, with any of the pieces, looking at sight or looking at working with place, I'm more interested now about the gift of people having their own experience and needing these sort of sensory walks or looking at tacit knowledge, which you can't document. And I think the whole documentation thing, and Richard Long is also, you know, a whole other discussion in a way. But Richard Long is always the person that comes up with every walking and it's always about traces. And, you know, there's something about the vibrant matter of, you know, we could talk about vibrant matter of place. I think for me, his work, actually what's more interesting about the legacy of his work in terms of documentation is the moment where, not the photographs, but the kind of the text-based work that points to a structure that he's done, and then it leads you as the audience or the viewer to have that imagination, and the activity is actually about the participation of the person perceiving that, not the photograph. Okay, I think there is an interesting translation of this work. But yeah, I could say a lot more.
That's really interesting. Should we go to Gabby?
Yeah.
If she can hear us.
Can you hear us, Gabby? Oh, yes.
You know?
Yes. Yeah.
If you're listening, I think the headphones work better. Yeah, hello.
Hello. Gabby, did you hear Jonathan's initial question?
Only part of it, to be really honest. Maybe, Jonathan, could I ask you to...
Yeah, sure. It was just
yeah, and maybe speak up a bit or come closer.
Come closer.
Yeah, it was it's just about the implication or the longer term implications. What remains at the end of the work.
So it was about the longer term implications, Gabby, and what remains at the end of the work. The word legacy is being talked about.
Yeah, the word legacy has a couple of times.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm improvising it because I had a feeling it was that kind of question. While this was Ruth talking, right?
Yes.
Just talking, yeah. While she was talking, also some parts I caught and some parts I didn't, so I made up my own story of what the conversation was going on. So what it really led me to think about this aspect of time, and that we're here to talk about architecture and dance, and that's really like substantial difference between the two forms, the two art forms, that how they work with time and how they work with legacy. Like dance is so much of a momentary nature. It's about the moment so much, or in history, or it's just the way it's perceived. It's a moment, a thing of the moment. And architecture is so much about creating it takes a lot longer to create a work, and it's very much, the idea is about its legacy, about it staying, about it, when it's done, then it's there. And this is I think it's a really interesting thing about the two forms meeting, that they're so, in their nature, so different. And again, what to make of it, and I think then what I quote of the work of Ruth and Anne-Marie, that it's so interesting that they're working on much longer time spans, on projects that could be lasting potentially over 50 years, which in the sense of working with architecture, it's nothing. It's not very long. So to kind of rethink the idea of what dance, what performance work, what choreography can be in the sense of time, to say it's not, let's think about this in the span of 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years, a choreographic project that already makes it come, for me, makes the two art forms come much closer together. It's a different way to approach each other somehow. So this way I thought was something staying with me, very interesting. In terms of my own work for legacy, I think what I'm interested in now in terms of the sound installations, that it's a form of a living archive of a building or of a neighborhood. So that part of the way of making work like this, hidden spaces installation and sentiments and ants, is to see a part of the project. There are different phases to the project, and one part is the actual building relationships inside the community, developing the material together through memory. Then there is the act of the installation. But then the third step is, how does this archive, this living archive, continue? How can it stay available, and how did it somehow change the place that it was engaged in? But it can only, from my understanding, it can only change that if there is a longer, if it can stay for longer, if it leaves traces. So it's the same. For me, this idea of leaving traces, not in some way of leaving something behind is really important, and that's why I think for the stage work that I do, I don't know, it's a challenging question. How do I leave traces with a performance work in a city that I've toured in? It's a difficult question. It's not as easily solved, I think. But I think the question that you want to, that the bigger the traces are, you can leave, the longer they stay, the possibility for it to actually change the place that you're engaged with is, I think the change is more apparent if the traces can stay longer. Otherwise, it has this momentary moment of intervention, urban intervention. It's there for 5 minutes. Some people remember it, and then it's gone. And if that changed something, if the change initiated in an audience member then provokes an activity later on that changes on, like that, that is very, very relevant and important. But I think it's something to be aware of when working in this urban environment, and when really attempting to change with the act of embodiment, with the act of movement, with the act of performance in urban spaces, when you really want to achieve something, or when you want to leave change the place, then you need to think about legacy. Otherwise, it's there and then it's gone.
Thank you.
That's good, yeah.
Thank you, Gabby.
Do you want to pick up on that just briefly, and then we'll open it to the discussion.
Sure. Yes. So I have to think about the end point, because that's my purpose really, is to sort of think about how we can bring something positive change to the lives of residents who live in the neighbourhood. So some of those are more obvious and more visible and ones that we create. So they might be, for instance, with our ballet, bringing in dance forms that young people and their parents are aware of what a career in dance might look like and how we might do that, and what broadening of horizons might mean. And then there are sort of more nebulous kind of ideas of legacy, which are more about the psyche of people and place. And I think street dance for the Young Twin is just such a perfect example of that, because Tom will remember this. It kind of used the geography of Sneinton to have sort of small performances that kind of culminated in one at the end. And I think I'm interested. Gabby was talking about it needs to do longer term to create a resonance, because actually that performance, I don't know when it was, 2009, 6 years ago, it still gets talked about. And I had some glittery blue shoes that Jay Mason, the choreographer, insisted on being part of it. They were on the pavement, and someone locally, if I'm right, photographed them, and they do keep appearing every so often on Facebook. So I think, but what that creates is that then leads to other possibilities. So the idea of something called adjacent possibles, which is you do that, and then that kind of allows you to take your community onto something else. So for me, that's something like that has allowed us to kind of layer new and maybe more risk-taking things on top.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it has a kind of cumulative effect. So in some ways, the previous phase might not be so obvious, so visibly evident to an outsider.
Yeah. So
those involved, you're building on it, you're using that.
Absolutely, because afterwards the phrase I heard the most was not just to me, but a thank you to the project for showing people locally what was possible. Because I think especially when you're working in urban areas that are kind of known for being an area of deprivation, people kind of internalise that, and therefore the place internalises it. And I think what we're doing is sort of coming slightly left field, and we're making that word intervention, but it is a kind of a blowing open of sort of possibilities, and that affects people in a way that can't quite be pinned down, because it's about how they feel about what's possible. You're really just changing that physical space, beyond that moment.
Okay. Well, it's really open to now for questions and discussion. If anyone wants to pick up on points, or if there's cross connections between the speakers. Stuart and I will try and maintain
I think one thing that interests me, Alison's taken a photograph of my feet whilst I'm dancing, and it's this idea of Richard Long's photograph, and Cecilia hasn't been. The work is the dance itself is dance and story. The photograph itself is a photograph and a story, but there's a relationship between the two. So in many ways, the legacy is not necessary. I mean, and it's interesting about the photograph. It's always interested me. Who's the artist? Is it the photographer? Is it the person that's doing the dancing? And what's the relationship between the two of them? And I think that's always really interesting. I think the other thing that's interesting is positive and negative legacies, and skateboarding comes to mind on that in terms of urban design, because I'm an architect as well. And a lot of thought and effort goes into stop people from skateboarding on certain materials. And you now have designs where you have like little bits of matter sticking up, or you have little kind of indentations in the stone to prevent people from skateboarding in certain areas. That's a legacy. It's a negative legacy. And a positive legacy would be like Buenos Aires, when you've got Argentine tango. You then have the black and white tiles on the floor. And so you then have a ritual space set within the landscape, the urban landscape, where people can design. So I think there are legacies, and they're not always the ones that we think of. They're not always our conscious legacies. They can be a completely different one.
Yeah, that's it. It came up last night in the discussion about gallery-based work. Somebody worried about some flamenco dancing going on their nice
The legacy of the imprints.
Which I'm not really excited about. Fantastic trace of this amazing movement on the. But that's as an architect with a kind of mischievous way, hoping it was someone else's floor, not mine.
But it's an extension of the Richard Long idea, isn't it? It's this mark on the floor.
I think a kind of a hidden theme seems to me running through your presentation, something you were talking about, is mirror kind of representation as a mirror. And I wonder if you think about that, because the mirror looks like it, but it's not. It's the opposite. So you can never see the thing as it's intended, but you were talking about.
Well, I mentioned it just in reference to what you were saying, but I also have some interest in neuroscience as well, because I'm training to be a Feldenkrais practitioner, and that we talk a lot about, you can imagine the movement, and you work with somebody who imagines the movement on the left side, and then you imagine how it moves, how it moves on the right side of the body, and then you either enact it or not. But there's a sense of learning through this idea of mirroring, even internally potentially. But I think you're right, it's still not mirroring in that sense to me. It's still very much an embodied understanding of it. So I don't know. I think it can go one way or the other. In terms of mirroring, I mean as a reflection back to yourself that you can. It keeps changing. It's constantly in negotiation. It's not a set. It's not a set image. It's not a. This is just a thing that. It's maybe mirroring is the wrong description.
Well, I think mirroring is an interesting word, because it kind of might speak to a certain amount of truth, because the thing is, the thing about a mirror is that you can never see yourself. You can always see an image of yourself, which is a reverse. You think, oh, that's me, but in fact, no, it's the reverse image. And I think that might be an interesting kind of thought in that you talk about copying and people perhaps mirroring what you're doing, but is it a mirror, or is it an appearance of being the same?
But there has been studies, say for instance, about kinesthetic empathy of audience members watching dance. The Glasgow, I think a consortium of universities did that research from Glasgow or Northampton or yeah. I don't know if it was D or not, but anyway, okay. It was a group of people, but there's something interesting about this kind of mirroring in relation to one another. Still as a very felt sense of an understanding of what's happening when you're watching something. And for me, that's an interesting idea of mirroring, because it's not just based on this reciprocal visual thing that's happening, someone's feeling it in their muscles. There's an actual physical response to seeing dance, and I think in terms of Feldenkrais practice as well, that also fits in with a lot of the neuroscience. I'm not an expert on it all, but there's something about, I guess, just as an idea, like how do we keep reflecting back and how does that keep changing as a process for learning.
Well, it helps to remind us, I think, as you're saying, that we fool ourselves into thinking that we are seeing ourselves in the mirror when we aren't, which is sort of it's a nice way of reminding ourselves that however much we're reflected back by the environment, it's never exhaustive. We never have a complete image either of ourselves or of the world. It's always partial, and there are a million partial views of things, and still you never have that. You never see anything. Ponting talks about this a lot, which you kind of build basis on Husserl's philosophy we were just talking about just briefly now. So, but I think it's a really important idea. It's like we say, the mirror. It's too easy to fall into this idea that what you see in the mirror is the thing, or is an exact copy of the thing. That's equivalent when actually it isn't. Ponting uses the idea not so much about the mirror, but about the bits of your own body that you can't see. You can't ever see the back of your head and look at, down between your shoulders, however far you go. And
your imagination can begin to sense what that might be like and somehow build a picture.
Through your other sense, like your sense of proprioception.
Which comes back to this tacit knowledge and embodied knowledge that I think is really important in terms of how we make dance with people or for and with spaces and cities and architecture and everything that's kind of permeable and solid. But yeah, I think phenomenology feels like a very big sort of intellectual beast somehow in terms of the language of it. And it's like, how do we talk about phenomenology? This is a question for me, like how do I talk about that to people who I meet on the street? Or how do I talk about that with other artists? Or how do we find another language? Well, we find it through getting people to move and do it that way because that is the experience, the true experientialness of it.
It's another way of saying it.
This morning I was reading through a whole load of cultural geography papers and I've picked out about 10 from the year 2000 to the present, where phenomenology, performance and performativity is in there, and it's clearly sort of a way that thinkers or theorists have been looking at right from and feminist theorists like
Judith Butler.
yes exactly. So it's kind of interesting hearing you talk about the mirror and the image, and then you were talking about the taking of somebody else's image, and I know I don't want to go back to Richard Long and Hamish Fulton. I do think it's interesting that they're not in there. They physically are not in there. They're in their work by their experience, but they're not physically in there. And whether there's something in that. Sorry, I'm rambling on a bit.
But then is that about representation?
Yeah.
And not, what is the legacy? Just representation of an act, or is, we try to show
Well, you can argue that it's everything, isn't it?
Yes.
It's the experience that you can never have again. It's the image that's come from that or the text. And I think you're absolutely right about, Richard Long again, about the experience of his text pieces allow the audience to have that imagination, which of course then takes you back to, another theorist about authorship and, the audience having more purchase on the response to the work.
Yeah, I was just picking up saying dance scholarship. Merleau-Ponty is the phenomenologist of choice, and he's rife at the moment. In fact, it's one of the things that came out of recent research exercise and reports was they're probably doing too much of that and I'm using it too much. But really, I think why dance researchers and artists are drawn to it is because of the way it deals with the lived experience, the way it gives a way to articulate an embodied knowledge in some way. But I wanted to kind of pick up something else around that you introduced this idea of liminality. And position it really within that kind of more carnivalesque notion of something being a transformative state that might be temporary, that might be a place that we go through. And I was interested in that in relationship to this word legacy. That one of the kind of what's possible in that transformative moment, that liminal space that might be a series of liminal spaces that you revisit or cycle, or it might be a one-off if you think about it in terms of time. But that it doesn't have to then, I wonder actually if we ever fully close the box and what are the leaks that happen afterwards. So if you think about it in those kind of, having open Pandora's box, maybe not all of it ever goes back in. And so if you think about legacy in those ways and what are its kind of leaks, what is it that we can't put back in a box having opened it, whether that gives kind of, that resonates in some way with your practices.
Very much so. Yeah. I think the reflection of the idea of actually a performance happening without anyone preparing, without being realising for it, gets rid of the thresholds. No one's ready for it, and suddenly you have this experience happening like that, and suddenly it stops. And the legacy of that is very different from someone who's decided they're going out for a nice evening to go and see some dance, and they're going to kind of have a drink of wine, and then go into the space and then watch it and come out again. And and those thresholds, those are liminal processes you go through. And I think they make it safe. I think they mean control what the legacy is going to be. Whereas the other one is completely unsafe. You have no control of what the legacy is. You have no control about who's going to be there, anything like that.
So safe for who? Safe for the audience or safe for the performers? Because the audience actually in flash mobs are certainly now very contrived and organised. So it's actually pretty safe for the performer. There's something about a different relationship between an audience of choice, that's organised and made a trip to go somewhere specifically, as opposed to somebody who might come across something and make a choice to stay with it or not when they come across it. And whether that makes a difference to the way you understand them.
That was part of a question I've been thinking, maybe a little bit more to you, Susanna, in that way of people going into those spaces, some of those communities we've all talked about, and I know we've talked about the farmers, and when you've gone into those, is there a resistance? Do people want those works of art in those spaces? How does...
I think it's really interesting because when you're working in these particular neighbourhoods, it's about territory, and it's safety for many of those residents is about the known. Yeah. And so when you're bringing something that isn't received ideas of what dance is, so it's not straight out of something like popular culture, because some of those people might not have been introduced to some of the work that they're more familiar with, so that's quite confronting for them. And when we were rehearsing street dance with lone twins, so we were just in small, sort of individual groups on the street, and we were doing it in the evening because we were trying to work around people's schedules. And there seemed to be a pattern of, so you get a group of kind of young people would come into it and they'd immediately go into confrontation with it. So they would be, swearing, trying to intervene, mimicking it, and so sort of just talking to them, just kind of saying, this is what we're trying to do, and you're welcome to watch, but this is when it's going to happen. And so just that kind of what I always call the hand-holding, which on a project like that ballet takes months, but actually for that you have to be very immediate. And then the next kind of, that moving through that kind of transformative process would be, was it like strictly, or was it like this? And then you sort of say, no, it's like that. And then you sort of get to a point, always where they kind of stay and watch for a bit, and then go off about their business. And I just remember one guy just going, good luck with your dancing. And it just, from that kind of confrontation to that, so that in itself is a transformative effect, and the leaks from that, we don't know what they are, because they've just kind of moved through what we're doing. But yes, it's the leaks that I'm interested in, but that's where there's a lot of responsibility, I think.
I think that's, the word leaks really excited me inside of Pandora's box, and it also kind of made me equally jump to the other side, which is the data, the evidencing, the empirical, how do we sort of make sense of this and grasp? And then I quite like this, I think kind of Gary mentioned it earlier as well, the sort of the ephemeral, the moment, the sort of spontaneity, or not, or the intuitive, and all of this stuff that's so embodied in place and dance and moment and things like that, kind of being sometimes of a different world of the notion of what it is we're trying to do, which is there's a kind of invisibleness and a potentially here, and then there's this sort of desperation to order and organise and make visible and evidence and things like that. And maybe it's not obviously that clear, but there's an interesting kind of at the centre of both of these things, there's a kind of fundamentally different sort of something.
I mean, as part of the Flatlands project, what I'm going to try and do is work with, we've got these 3 farmers, and I want to just do a little private harvest ritual with each of them, which probably won't get documented. So how does that, what's that?
But do you think they'll repeat it next year?
I don't know. I don't know, but it feels like that they're really up there. So about them being invited in, we've incredibly welcome farms, but that's because we've had a really long time to build a relationship with them.
And maybe they don't know.
And they're up for exploring different things.
Yeah.
Does it matter whether they think it's art, or does it matter their sort of perception of what you're, how you sort of frame what you're doing? Because that's another part of the sort of leakage thing very often.
Yes.
It's kind of things become so embedded in a context that we kind of, we didn't realise it was art.
Yeah.
We just did it. Is this art? We just did it anyway. We enjoyed it. Is that all right? Is that then perhaps more likely to have a longer life?
It's sometimes much more healthy to just put that, to say, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
But that's not the conversation. The conversation is this.
But it's funny when you talk about bureaucracy and art funding and things like there was a survey done via the phone asking people if they engaged in the arts. And they were engaging with the arts, but they didn't know that they were. They didn't realise they were. So you couldn't kind of pick up. So, there's that kind of bureaucratic necessity, the legacy, to know that what it was art in order to justify.
Rather philosophical question, really, isn't it?
Which is ridiculous, which is also tied in with the whole commodification of art as well. I had a question. Is this? Last night we were talking about exchange and almost the justification of. Were we asking galleries and contemporary art to justify, or were dancers asking them to justify their position as contemporary art? Is any of this about exchange between architects and choreographers and dancers? Is any of this about dancers and choreographers impacting upon the design of buildings and spaces? Is that some of the legacy? Is that a legacy?
Well, potentially, yes. I mean, I wouldn't say no.
You then come across this permanent ephemeral, don't you?
Yeah.
Architecture in normal circumstances is permanent, whereas dance is very ephemeral. And actually, the interaction occurs when they start not being, when one starts becoming more permanent and having legacies, and architecture becomes.
Yeah, well, like the 1% for Art initiative, whenever that started 20 years ago or so, I guess most of those 1% were spent on a big thing, sitting on the turd in the plaza kind of model, was because you want something concrete, or whatever, company boards want something concrete they can show at their annual shareholders meeting. This is what the money was spent on. And that's a challenge, I guess, as well. I mean, given the kind of art that we're talking about. The idea of you being an artist in residence, I can't remember which one of you it was, but engineering, it was Loughborough, wasn't it?
Well, we're both are a bit different. I'm an engineer in Sheffield. And
oh yeah, in Sheffield, that's right, you were talking about. I think that's really interesting, because that seems to me like the challenge is that this is 1% for art model, in the sense that you have to engage with an artist, their practice. It's not just making an object to sit outside the front door. It's becoming more embedded in the culture of the organisation, potentially, but I don't have a huge experience of this, but it seems like an interesting model. So
I'm just thinking, it seems to me that your project on collecting memories and around the Bandit project with Dance 4.
That's Gabby.
Sorry, Gabby. Gabby is all keep on your thing.
I'll relate to you, Gabby.
Yeah, but it seems to me that project, all attached to the design of the new building, and then sort of something that's to try not be a new building being imposed on a community, but actually be integrated into their thinking and their the desires of the community in some way is all part of that kind of trying to help an art process be integrated with a community process.
Did you hear, Gabby?
The last bit, yes, absolutely, but the question around it was specifically what?
There wasn't really a question.
It's kind of around the process of when you made hidden spaces, starting to make a process that kind of develops a community, particularly around, moving into new spaces for Dance 4, so some of that thinking.
I think hidden spaces particularly, for me, was a massive learning curve in terms of all of the whole complexity around artists being interested, getting involved with a neighborhood, and lots of different types of communities that are part of that neighborhood, and how do I engage with that what can I offer to that place, and how can I not try and impose any idea of something that I want to do with them into that neighborhood. How can I really engage into a dialogue that's productive? And there's that opened a whole range of questions and complexities about what's my place as an artist in entering a community or entering a neighborhood and working with them. So I don't know exactly how, maybe you can ask a little bit more specific about the thing. So because I don't want to just say, it was great and I learned a lot and it helped Dance 4 to move into the community. Like I can say all these things now, but it's much more complex than that, and it's really it opened lots of questions for me around, also in terms of entering a territory, an unknown territory for me, entering the everyday life territory of a local neighborhood that I don't know, and that's some. I think it's a fragile place for artists to work in. So that's, I don't know. I guess I'm opening more questions now. Maybe tell me if there's some.
I feel like someone should, in a way, almost define or open up what we even define as architecture. Because actually a lot of this is we're talking about is social spaces. But when you use the word architecture, often you might think, of these permanent bricks and mortar, and a lot of artists are talking about actually the social and the political spaces, not necessarily the physical buildings. Yeah.
As a long distance walker, I see architecture as everything around me, wherever I am at any given moment.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think the average person in the street, if there is such a thing, sees architecture as man-made bricks, cement, etc. I think if you went down the street now and asked people what architecture was, I'm sure they'd say that. I doubt if many would say what I just said. But straight away I can see that you... No, I'm a teaching assistant, but this one I'm very much a long-distance walker. I helped run the Long-Distance Walkers Association for... I'm the longest servant, I call it the longest servant. In its history, I've been helping for 28 years, out of 43 now. that it's existed. So I'm very particularly interested in I'm interested in what everybody does, obviously I'm particularly interested in what you three do, because I notice you're very interested in walking as well. That's what you do.
But I guess that walking practice, somehow came out of making work at Nottingham University as a student, and how architecture and social spaces define how we walk through spaces as well.
Yes.
And then you go on long distance walks and you see the politics of also, how people manage landscapes, or
you have to negotiate.
Or how you negotiate.
You started talking earlier about, you talked about a walk where you ended up walking, trying to walk through buildings that were in Wales, or through streams. Yes.
Because it's a view.
Sometimes we do that because we're wrong, but sometimes we do it because it's just, they're just there.
Well, it makes you really acutely aware of it, and I think that's one of the things that I really like about kind of the body as a kind of understanding of ourselves in terms of human scale. When you rely on just what you have as a way of navigating and moving, as opposed to any expanded technology, including maps or anything, maybe, but that, you're already up against this way that somebody else has come from a very different place in order to place that path or that fence, or to move that, and then suddenly it's like this fence is really real when it's just you. Especially 5'2" of you.
Only one of us is flexible.
Well, some of
the building fence, rather than the fence move. Unfortunately, we are extremely flexible. We can go around and go through. You can go over sometimes. Go under it sometimes.
I'm just working on the southwest coast part at the moment. I'm doing a 2-day walk there.
Yes.
And literally, I'm working with climate scientists, and the walk is about change, and you can physically see the change. It's part of literally falling away. But it's only by being there. It's only by being there that you can feel that change. Like someone can tell you that that's happening, but unless you're physically there, or like we stood outside Durnell Door last year, and then we saw a photo. We took a photo there, and then 3 weeks later that bit of path.
That's very much architecture, isn't it?
Yeah. When the paths have to be rebuilt, or the Dawlish line has to kind of get rebuilt.
But you can only do that through physical embodiment of being there, I think, to actually feel that, and that's why I'm trying to take the walk there to look at.
I did the entire walk in 1982. That was a one-off walk.
Oh my God!
25.
You're really hardcore.
25 ladies at an average of 22 miles a day, apparently. It seems like it's 24 miles now, but it's extended. I have been visited little parts of it since, but obviously I haven't done the whole thing. I wouldn't be able to do the whole thing now, because I have the time then. I'm a bit inverted. I sort of took my retirement when I was in the 20s. That's not impressed, but it sort of worked. I'm sure it'll go wrong one day, but it's okay at the moment. So it would be fascinating to go back and actually walk the whole thing. I find it harder now, I think, when I do it then. I'm sort of dancing on. I would imagine it's changed a lot, both in terms of nature and what with beings have taken its literally on its path, or outside of its path.
This is a big,
So what fascinates me, and actually is something about you mentioned the word change, and I'm suddenly in a place of thinking that's in acknowledging the changing of place and space and body and our connections to people. In opening up new spaces, it's acknowledging that change can't just be about future. It's not just about the future, it's actually about the acknowledgement of what's already there and present and alive from those things that have leaked over many years and so on. And actually, by in some way acknowledging that and accepting that and that informing these kind of adjacent possibles, then hopefully what happens next is that we might not be there in 40 years' time, but actually by the longevity of engagement and acknowledging those links, maybe there is that thing which the legacy word that acknowledge, which has accepted that we're part of that change.
And on that note,
Yes.
and longevity, beautiful rounds up. I'm going to bring the session to a close. Just before I do my thank yous, just want to say, if you haven't got a leaflet, please pick one up. The symposium carries on. We have another discussion later on this evening and one tomorrow, and then on Saturday and Sunday, Alison, who's joined us today, is taking us on a walk as part of the symposium. A short walk to a long dance. So that's happening on Saturday and Sunday. But thank you to Jonathan for opening up today's session, and to panelists. So to Susanna, to Gabby, thank you. To Simone, to Ruth and Marie. Thank you all very much.